I'm looking at digital disruption and strategic sense making capabilities of boards. And in fact, the reason I'm in Dubai is because I'm over here in the context of digital disruption and looking at what's coming down the tracks, and it is just fascinating. And I would say that most executives have no clue. So we have been talking about digital transformation all day, or you guys have at least. I'll change my view here so I can see my screen. And look, one of the things in my experience is that it's very hard to get a board or an executive team to be able to tell you what they mean by digital transformation. But yet they're all doing it. And that always puzzles me in terms of how can you do digital transformation if you haven't decided what you mean by digital transformation. It is ambiguous, and it's also difficult to structure from top down. What we do know for a fact, though, is that most digital transformations fail. And depending on who you want to listen to, it's as high as 80%. So we know there is a problem in terms of digital transformation. The area I'm focused in on, though, is the board. And no one, to my mind, is asking the question, if 70 to 80% of digital transformations are failing, well, where was the board in all of this? Because to my mind, the board is responsible for setting the strategic direction of the firm and the risk appetite. And in the context of digital transformation, should be approving, guiding, and overseeing digital transformation. But yet it's not working, and there doesn't seem to be any accountability. And that's something that I'm trying to get under in terms of understand. Well, it's not sufficient to say, well, the organization failed. If the boards are responsible for the future of the organization at the highest level, the boards should have some accountability in this, or they should have capabilities that can help the firm decide on the best course of action, ambiguous and all as it might be. So I started looking at, well, what is the role of the board? And the traditional roles come up in terms of agency theory. The board holds the executive to account, and that's particularly true in relation to conduct in today's world. But it's kind of nearly adversarial. The board is representing the shareholders, and management have to do what they're supposed to do. Alternative views around resource-based theory, where the board actually works with the executive to figure out, well, what is the strategy? And how should we go about the strategy? And look, I did a board offsite in the UK there last week, a 2-day offsite, and this is typical of most organizations where the board and the executive get together and they think about the future. The problem is they do it once a year if they're lucky, and we're in a world where things are changing by the day. So another view would be, well, okay, well, if we can become a knowledge-based company and we can learn more about the world that we're in, and we have greater knowledge, well, surely that will give us competitive advantage. Now, all of these theories, when I looked at them all, they all had advantages, but they all had shortcomings as well. And in terms of resource-based theory, it doesn't adequately explain how firms have competitive advantage in rapid and unpredictable change situations. And one of the things Paddy and I often talk about is, you see all these books about, great companies and whatnot. Well, Paddy reminds me, well, the companies that failed probably did the same things as well. So, it's not just necessarily about the resources. So Thies looked at this and sort of said, well, it's really around looking at dynamic capabilities to explore how firms behave when the market is turbulent, or when it's driven by innovation-based competition. And essentially, it does differ. While it's based on resource-based theory, it differs because it focuses on how firms dynamically renew their resource base for competitive advantage. And you can apply that also in the knowledge space in terms of knowledge-based dynamic capabilities to focus on in terms of how does the organization continually renew its knowledge base to address the changing environment. So as I was start thinking about this, I was looking at competitive advantage, and this kind of struck me that, in moderately dynamic markets, competitive advantage is destroyed from the outside. But in high velocity markets, actually, the problem isn't just the outside. The problem is the inside of the firm, where actually, what you thought were your capabilities actually collapse, and you get left behind. And we've seen this time and time again, where firms that were market leaders suddenly, well, it didn't happen suddenly, it felt suddenly, but suddenly their market was totally disrupted and they could not compete and they went out of business. So it kind of struck me that when we're thinking about this, we need to be thinking about, our competitive advantage is not just about, the outside world, it's also about the inside world. And I think part of the problem with a lot of the management teaching is that it's predicated on intensity of competition within your industry. As we know in a digital world, well, you can't define your industry because your competition can come from anywhere. The other thing that struck me was, that, in dynamic capabilities, they're really focused on, how do you get the best resource base that's future orientated, where your capability is really around how you're competing today. But importantly, they are static. So if you're not actually, dynamically developing them, they actually start to degrade, and you run the risk of losing your competitive advantage. So dynamic capabilities explicitly acknowledge that as the markets and technologies evolve, firms need to adjust by reallocating assets and learning new skills. And that's, really sensing the opportunity. And this is critical. How do organizations, and the board in particular, how do they sense what's going on out there, as opposed to maybe accepting management's view of what's going on out there? How can the board make sense of it for themselves? And then how can they, guide the organization that it can seize the opportunity by reallocating resources, or adjust competencies, or develop new ones altogether? So that brought me back to board sense making. And when I look, at sense making, why I would define it as, creating a plausible account of confusing events and then enacting it accordingly with newly acquired skills, helping the organization deal with specific issues. And strategic sense making was really around, where the leaders and other organizational members, deal with specific issues, strategic issues, to construct a shared understanding of the issues under consideration and the actions taken by the organization. So as I was pondering this, I was saying, but it still doesn't tell us, how do boards go about sense making? Nor does it tell us, is it a process or is it a capability? Because in an ideal world, the board would have the ability or the capability to make ongoing sense making, so that as the world continues to evolve, they're able to make the best possible decisions regarding the organization's future to ensure that it is both competitive and relevant. So then I said, well, okay, if we look across all of the different theories that I was looking at and sort of say, well, let's take agency, resource-based, knowledge-based, dynamic capabilities, and sense making, and I look across them, and the data side, and Barry was talking about that there a minute ago, interpretation, enactment, and shared understanding. And I'll just deal with sense making in the interest of time here. But sense making in terms of data, collect the experiences, the events. Interpretation, interpret and give meaning to the data. Enactment, inform decision making and adaptation. And under shared understanding, encourage open communication and shared understanding. And I equally said, okay, well, what about in terms of assessment and interpretation? And for sense making, is well, how do you interpret the experience and the events that are happening around you? In terms of strategy formulation, how is it informing decision making based on sense making? And in terms of adaptation, enhanced adaptability and resilience. In terms of the external environment, continuously scanning and interpreting the environment that is out there. And part of the problem with organizations is they don't do that. Or even if they do, they're not able to put it in context in terms of, how might this disrupt our business, or what might this mean in terms of how our business needs to change. In terms of organizational processes and culture, it encourages open communication and shared understanding. And then in terms of, resources and knowledge management, leverages sense making for insights for better decision making. So I know that's a whistle-stop tour, but I try to pull this together. And look, this is still work in progress, because I'm not as far down the road as my colleagues who've been presenting here today. But I looked at this and sort of said, well, look, on one level, you got the board of directors, which is my primary focus. We got the C-suite executives who are, the top leaders of the organization. You got management, can be senior management, middle management, and you got employees. And, how do we make sure that, this all works? And, we can assume, well, it's a broad assumption, I suppose, but look, let's work on the basis that firms have moved beyond just pure agency theory, and that there is, knowledge-based view, there is resource-based view, and hopefully there's a voice of the customer coming in there. And that's all very helpful. But what it doesn't answer is this question here in terms of, well, how does sense making get enacted, or how does the board of directors go about sense making, and particular strategic sense making that helps the board to determine what the future direction should be, but also creates that focal point for discussion with the executive in terms of what the future might be. And if you take the unitary board, it'll have a diverse background. So many of your board directors will come from outside the industry, which is quite advantageous in theory because they shouldn't have fixed views in terms of the future direction. But then how can the executive then take that sense making and then sense give to the organization and then to the employees how they receive it? But equally, as they receive it and they try to enact it, they meet the real world and then they start to sense make themselves. So we need to find out, is there a way that this can become a dynamic capability where the organization and particularly the board is continuously sensing for strategic sense making to guide the organization. So where am I? Well, I've done a lot of reading. I haven't done enough. There's two areas that I need to look at in particular. So I need to do more work around boards and strategic decision making. I also need to do more on prospective sense making. So most of the sense making material is retrospective sense making. So we make sense of what is happening based on what we experienced in the past. But how do we make sense of something where actually there is no past experience? So I need to do more work on prospective sense making. I also, Paddy and Steve put me on notice that I need to remove my expert hat because I work in this area and I work with boards and executives on digital disruption, digital transformation. I also lecture on it, etc. I run the risk that actually I might force the answer. And I don't want to do that. But I need to do that piece first so that I can then finalize my research objective and then finalize the approach, which is going to be qualitative work with boards of directors or individual directors or a combination of directors off boards so that I can start to answer the question in terms of how do boards go about sense making, and is there a framework that could be developed to help boards better with sense making and better with digital transformation. So that was what I was going to cover for today, Buddy, and I'm sorry that it was late getting here, guys, but hopefully it gives you a sense of where I'm at.
No, very, very interesting, Tony. And I know I can see questions or points coming in already here. But Tony, one thing, and I think it probably ties with at least one of the points made in the chat as well, is isn't part of the issue, and we see it probably increasingly, where and probably one in particular that's been in the news a lot recently here in Ireland, that that boards are taking their signals from filtered sources from within their own organization, and very often they're not seeing the full reality, the true reality, or not seeing beyond the reality within their own organizations.
No, 100%, buddies. Yeah, I think there's two issues. One is, I think, when boards hear digital transformation, they think it's a technology issue, and that immediately, puts them out of their comfort zone. If they actually just stood back from it and say, well, actually, this is about being competitive and relevant in the future. So it's about our business model, it's about our customers, it's about how we bring our people on board. It's all those type of things instead. That would be a far better place for the board because every board director can engage on that. But the problem in the executive team is, digital transformation is not necessarily a good thing from an executive's perspective, right? Because it disrupts the status quo. It may actually, create a new power imbalance. It may actually, run the risk of, destroying a legacy for someone who only has, 2 years to go. So the board need to independently make sense of the world, in my view, so that they can constructively challenge and engage with the executive to say, well, yeah, we hear what you're saying. However, we also want to discuss these dimensions or these aspects, because if the board doesn't have that capability, they're always going to get the tram track view in terms of, well, here's what we've done, or here's what we want to do based on what we've always done, as opposed to, well, actually, let's forget about everything. I mean, one question I often ask boards is, what if you were starting again tomorrow? Would you do the same thing? And I've never had a board say, yes, we would. So I think the problem is that if the boards are out of their comfort zone and management are moving into a comfort zone, which is not necessarily challenging the management in terms of how disruptive they should be to themselves, you end up with a suboptimal digital transformation that has been signed off or rubber stamped by the board, and it ultimately fails because they never set out to transform.
Yeah, but I suppose one of the the cures, or what we were told was going to be one of the cures for this, was extra diversity on boards. But has it really addressed the issue? And again, I'm thinking in terms of one of the organizations, as I said, in the news at the moment.
No, I think when we're thinking about boards, I mean, look, boards were. I think when the question of diversity comes up, the conversation gets skewed. Really, what we need to have is a diverse set of perspectives on the board from different backgrounds, whatnot, that don't just accept the status quo. And just because the leadership say, well, actually, let's do some incremental change because that's going to make sure we're competitive. The board needs to be able to say, well, no, actually, we don't see that as challenging. We don't see it as disruptive. We don't see it as safeguarding the future of the organization. So I think really what we need to do is we need to educate boards, but we also need to equip them, Bodhi, with, how do they make sense of this? Because they're receiving, the forests from the executive team. Here's the reports on, all this disruption or whatnot. Really what they need to be able to sort of say is, well, if we think of our business, in 2030 or 2027 or whatever it might be, and we think of what it might look like in that context, what does that say about where we are today and how do we make sense of that? And then how do we figure out what we need to do to transform to get there?
Yeah, and I think, look, this is aligns really nicely with a point made by Steve here. He says, very interesting, Tony. It may also be important to consider sense breaking, where assumptions are being challenged before considered valid. Really powerful statement. And the top-down versus bottom-up approach would also be relevant here. So that's a point from Steve. Ken saying sense-making, encouraging open collaboration, sense receiving, etc. In my experience, usually found to be management speak, espoused but not enacted. Would like to find more. I would like to find out more as you go, Tony, on how to unlock this prospective sense-making time. And that's an interesting point in terms, Tony, of your own focus. Is your own focus to understand how boards are currently making sense, or or are you looking to advocate an alternative way of them making sense? Because I think that's a big difference from a research point of view.
Yeah, I look, I know that's a question I need to answer, Cody. I mean, ideally it would be the latter, but it may have to be, well, actually, how the hell do boards make sense today, and how can they make sense going forward? So ideally, it would be, well, here is a way that boards can make sense, but I probably first need to get my arms around, well, how do they do it today?
Yeah, and like it's a big challenge to bring a new way of sense making into boards and that they will accept it, or and it's back to some of the earlier points about, it's one thing thinking outside the box, but then getting people to implement that in a box is can be a real challenge. So I think
in there though, Paddy, this whole question I raised at the start in terms of, like, where is the accountability at the board level? I think, if more questions were being asked about organizations and their boards in terms of, well, hang on, you have spent all these hundreds of millions and you still have failed. Where was the board? So I think boards need to step up, because the disruption is not going away. In fact, it's going to intensify.
Yeah. See, I think part of the challenge as well, Tony, we might possibly be of different genders, we might be of different even skin colors, but if we all keep on being educated in the same way from the same institutions, to think in the same way about management leadership, I'm not sure you're going to get real diversity of thought, because actually a lot of boards probably do believe they're looking for the sort of known unknowns or the unknown, but actually they're so cognitively compressed that they just don't see them. It isn't that they're ignoring them or not seeing them, it's just that they don't see them, And I think Magella has a really interesting comment here, very interesting what you're saying. I remember issues being brought to a board in an organization that I worked in, and although all signs of pointed towards it collapsing, towards a project collapsing quickly, their response was this. There was a reason we chose this route. It was a defensive response. It was almost to say that if they changed now, it would mean that they got something wrong. Comes back to your point on accountability. Very insightful presentation. Any comment about that, Tony?
No, I agree. I look, there is a risk. I mean, digital transformation does not come without risk. It's grand you have someone like me stand up and say digital transformation is nirvana and that sort of stuff. But if you're running an organization, we talk about the ambidextrous organization. You still need to keep the lights on while you're trying to build the organization of the future, and that requires a mindset that can manage that ambiguity and sort of set the direction, but know that it's directionally right, but there are going to be things that are going to change as we get more understanding and make better sense, and our sense making improves through better data and insights.
Yeah. And I think tools can be used to actually stretch the way we make sense as well. And we're seeing that a lot in terms of even AI, AI coming up with scenarios that the typical creative human just couldn't see or maybe wouldn't see. So I think there's probably a use of sometimes just asking people to make sense differently or to think differently isn't enough. You nearly need a catalyst or something in the room to point out what they're not seeing because it's not obvious to them. And I think possibly AI or other elements have, and I know I was involved in a conversation, was it yesterday evening, about something very, very similar, that even as designers, we very often think we're very diverse in terms of view, but sometimes it takes something else to show actually we're very narrow in the way we're looking at a problem or a solution. So just a few final points, Tony, and apologies again for rushing you along. So John is saying the landscape of initiatives is littered with shiny, cool technologies. Which are abandoned, which is I think talking your language as well, Tony. Pat is saying great insights from Barry about a previous conversation.